panel. I don't know whenever Ryan, you want me to start? So the title of the panel was From Rails to Merb, because that's a talk that people ask us to cover. I think we're going to cover a bit more than that. So if you have any type of questions, we have also an RSC moderator over there, Mark, who's going to take questions for people watching live. There is a bit of delay, so we're going to try to answer everybody's questions. I think that's about it. We have 2 mics running in the room. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll bring a mic to you. I think that's about it. Are we streaming? Can we get started? I don't know. Yeah.
All right.
What's that? Oh, we should introduce the panel?
Ourselves, or?
Yeah, just introduce yourself.
I am Andy Delcom. I work for Engineered on the web team, and I write Merb applications.
I'm Yehuda. I'm, I think, the maintainer of Merb at the moment, and lead developer, Matt says. I work full-time at Engineered on Merb, and yeah, Engineered is awesome, and so is Merb. Hooray.
Okay.
My name's Daniel. Just work on Merb, and I work for Engineered too, and it's cool.
Well, my name is Matt Amonetti. I don't work for Engineered. As far as I know, I'm not planning on working for Engineered, but they're really nice people. I run a consultancy shop here in San Diego. And, that's about it.
Yeah, and I'm Carl Lurch. I work for Engineered now.
Fascinatingly, that wasn't really planned.
Yeah.
That's cool anyway.
When did you start?
I don't 2 weeks ago. It didn't change much when I started. I mean, just kept working on Merb, but anyway, yeah.
So we also have other people that are part of what we kind of call the core team.
Yep. Yeah, the core team is not just Engineered. That isn't just an accident. I guess Engineered paid for us all to be here.
Yeah.
So we have other people that are basically they're just people that get involved with the decision-making process. We have Fabian Frazen, who's in Belgium, is watching now. We have Michael Klishin, who's in Ukraine.
Yep.
We have Tim, what's Tim's last name?
Tim Carey
Gary Smith, who actually does work at Engineered, interesting.
But he lives in New Zealand, so.
He does live in New Zealand.
And obviously Ezra, who's not here right now.
Oh. Sure.
Yeah.
If you would like to be, if you would like to be down here, you're welcome to be down here. So I guess what we're going to do is talk about, is get people's questions. I think the topic of the panel was originally migrating from Rails to Merb, but you could ask about that if you want, or you could ask about anything that you want to know about Merb. So I guess we'll take any questions, whoever is floating around with microphones and such.
Go ahead, introduce yourself, Ezra.
It's crazy.
All right. I'm Ezra. Hi.
I've got a question. What is Thor, and how do we use it?
I'll take that. So basically, a lot of people use Rake. Rake was sort of a hack, became the lingua franca of making scripts in Ruby, even though it was never really intended to be used to make scripts in Ruby. It was designed to make it easier to compile programs in Ruby. But I guess it did a really good job of scripts. But it didn't have command line arguments and all sorts of things. So actually what most people did when they started making binaries is pull out, I don't know, get opts or get ops long or cool options or I don't know. There's like 20 possible things. But all they did is provide a way to get options out. And what I realized at one point was that actually there was a common, it actually is really similar to how Rails works, which is what you really usually want to do when you're building a non-trivial binary is there's like a binary and then there's a command like git install or gem install or git remote or, right, there's a binary, a command, and then potentially some options that could be mandatory or optional, and then some potentially dash kind of options, right? So I just wrote a thing that lets you route command line parameters to a controller kind of thing, and it's really easy. A lot of people found it really easy to use as a binary, and I also added sort of on a lark the ability to have a runner that you could So you can install these scripts in your system and use them sort of like how Rake works. So it wasn't originally intended that way. It was originally intended just to run your own binaries, but then I realized people might want to reuse them. Actually, Chris Wanstroth came over to me and said, nobody's going to use this unless you make it as easy to use as Rake. And I said, okay, cool. So it is as easy to use as Rake. It has the same namespace concept, but it uses namespaces that are classes and modules, not its own custom namespace thing like Rake. I actually wrote it, and then I was like, I'm not going to make Merb use this. We're just going to use Rake. And then a bunch of people in Merb were like, it's obviously a useful thing because we have all these command line options, and trying to put it into Rake isn't working. So other people actually wrote some Thor tasks, and that's cool. And the Thor tasks that now come with Merb let you do things like bundle Merb apps into your bundle Merb and other gems into your app, and etc. Did that answer the question?
Well, you can also install the task system-wide, which is a bit like Psyche. So it's a mix of Psyche and Rake.
Yeah,
Plus the awesomeness of Ruby itself.
So just like how Saki is like, oh, Rake, it would be great if I could make these tasks in the system. So Thor just has built in a way to say, I want this task to be in the system, and you can give it a URL or a file name, and it'll just work. Cool.
Testing. Okay. So Rails is super easy to install. All you have to do is say gem install Rails. Now there's the Thor task, which downloads all of the Merb code, and you have to have Git for all that. What is the core doing address to get, people who want to switch interested and easy up and running?
All right, so you don't need Git to use Merb. Git is just if you want to be on head, meaning if you want to get the latest version from Git itself. We provide you with gems, and tonight we're going to release 1.0 RC. So you're going to be able to do sudo gem install Merb, and that's going to get you the full stack, which is something we can talk a bit more about if you're interested. But basically, you do not need Git to run Merb. You don't need to be on head. You probably should not unless you really know what you're doing. The reason why a lot of people were using the Thor task to download from Git was because we didn't have, we would not release a new release every week, and people wanted to see what was going on before 1.0. But as soon as we have 1.0, you should really use the gems, especially because gems have a dependency system. So we will tell you which version to get, and when you do your sudo gem install, you'll get all the dependencies at once.
So just to clarify, you will be able to do gem install Merb and then Merb gen app, and you will be up and running just as fast as Rails.
That was actually, we had a sprint right before Merb camp, and I would say 90% of the purpose of that sprint was merely to make it as easy to get up and running, as easy as we could, versus Rails. And I think we've been rather successful.
And I think what Merb stack is going to play into that as well, right?
Yeah, so right now, if you do gem install Merb, right now it actually installs Merb stack. If you want like just the Merb core, you do gem install Merb core, and if you do gem install Merb more, it installs the additional like non-data mapper related parts of Merb. So most people who just want to get up and running quickly, they'll do gem install Merb, and then they'll do Merb gen app, their app, and it will make everything. It'll assume data mapper, etc. But if you actually don't want to make those assumptions, you can do Merb gen core, and it'll make an app it will generate an app that doesn't make any assumptions at data mapper or anything really.
And if you want one specific item from Merb more, you can also just install it directly. So if you want, for instance, I don't know, action args, and you just want to use core and action args, you can just do that too.
You can say gem install Merb action args or gem install haml, and then you just go into initRB and say dependency Merb haml. That's it.
All right. So Michael from somewhere here in the room is asking, what do you see as the biggest barrier to growth of Merb usage?
I think the biggest barrier has just been how fast we've been developing and how many changes we've been making. So I think that 1.0 is going to be a big barrier knocker, downer, or whatever you want to call it. As far as people could go, oh, well, now it's 1.0, the API is solid and stable, and I can install this and not have to worry that's going to change every week.
I also think some uncertainty about data mapper has been a barrier. So I'm pretty confident that will be getting better quickly.
Yeah, I think the reason why we came up with this idea of full stack is because people were complaining. They were saying, well, with Rails, I can get everything up and running. I know I need to do client work and I need to be efficient and I always do the same thing over and over. Is there any way you can provide us with a solution? Personally, most of us don't really need a stack because we already have our own stack system. But I think the stack would really help people getting up and running really fast. They don't need to figure it out how to get all the dependencies before they can get started. So I think that's going to be a major change. People will be able to play with Merb in 2 minutes, when before it was a bit harder.
And sort of an underreported thing about Stack in general is that because Merb Stack is really just like a packaging up of a bunch of existing modules, kind of like how Linux works, and there's like 50 million distributions, nothing really stops somebody from saying like, my company needs this exact stack. It's like pretty trivial to put together your own, and I wouldn't really care if other people wanted to release their own distributions of Merb, because Merb Stack is not, it's not like in Rails where you have to go in and like figure out how to extract dependencies out. You just comment, if you install Merb Stack and you comment out Merb auth from dependencies.rb, you don't have Merb auth anymore. So yeah, I think that's somewhat underreported in that I think a thing that a lot of companies need is they want to be able to build a thing. Let's say you do, every month you do a new client app, or you might have a bunch of people doing client apps at the same time. People want to build something that they could take from project to project. And so a combination of being able to build your own stack and slices, which lets you say like, oh, we have a CMS that we give to all our clients. We'll just make a slice out of that. I think there's a lot of value that is somewhat underreported, but as people start to do it, it will be like a big eureka moment where it's like, oh, we can actually do, companies that do client apps will have a lot of benefit out of it.
Just to clarify, to create a stack, you just need to create a new gem. And in your gem spec, you just need to say, here are the dependencies I want to use. I want to use Merb core. I want to use Active Record. I want to use prototype. Well, prototype, actually, you cannot define it in the gem itself. You need the generator. But anything else is just one single line. You just say, these are my dependencies. And because it's a meta gem, when you will try to install this gem, it's going to go and build everything for you. So seriously, it's like 15 lines of code.
Right, like the Merb gem itself doesn't have any code in it. It's just a rake file that knows how to build the dependencies and pull it in a big chain. So
and actually, there's a plugin generator also, which basically if you take the plugin generator and go into the rake file and add dependencies in the little gem spec area, that's it. You're done.
All right, next one from IRC. Justin from Philly asks, how do you guys find time to organize your work on various open source projects?
How? I don't sleep much.
Yeah, I second that.
Yeah.
I'm addicted. Hi, my
It's
name
fun,
is Ezra,
so yeah.
and I'm an open source-aholic.
Well, I have to thank Engineer. I'm the only one not working on Engineer here. And I have to really thank them because they allow their employees to spend time working on OSS. And that's something that's pretty great because not all of us can do that. And that's one reason why Merb is where it is right now. It's because Engineer has been able to sponsor this development.
Does Daniel have anything to say on this topic?
No, I don't get much sleep either, and I'm also an OSS-aholic.
All right, I guess next question.
Wait. Next one is Brian asks, what is the Engine Yard core team view on alternate Ruby implementations such as Rubinius and JRuby with Merb? And at the same time, someone else asks, does Merb run on JRuby?
Yes. I don't actually know what Engine Yard's position on that is. I don't know if Engine Yard has a position on that. But Merb is going to run on every alternative Ruby implementation that runs Rails, I think is basically. We don't do anything special. I think it's possible that in the future we may use some in development mode features of things like JRuby and Rubinius. But at the moment, anything that runs MRI, JRuby, Rubinius doesn't run Rails right now, so we can't run on that. But as soon as it does, we will.
I think Engineer's position is like anything that's Ruby is good.
Yeah, pretty
So,
much. I don't think Engine Yard. I don't know. You maybe know better than me. I don't think Engine Yard doesn't sit up at night try to figure out what exactly the strategy here is. Basically, we just want Ruby to be.
Our strategy
awesome.
is basically make Ruby win.
Exactly.
Period.
And JRuby and Rubinius are both a part of making Ruby win. And yeah,
It's not a competition. I mean,
Actually-
it is, but
I could actually say
we
something.
want everybody to win.
I could actually say something really concrete about JRuby, which is that I've been working with Charles Nutter for the last week or so to get action arc support in JRuby. So he actually gave me a bunch of Ruby code, Java code written in Ruby that I can use to get the same support for action arcs that we have in MRI now in JRuby, which means that in 1.0, I don't know about RC1 maybe, but definitely 1.0 will have action arc support in JRuby because basically we have a lot of JRuby is working very closely with Merb to make sure that there's nothing that we can do in Merb that we can do in MRI that we can't do in JRuby.
I just want to add that engineer never got involved into the decision making process. They never told us we need to get that working in this platform this way. This is the way it should work. Engineer really only supported us by allowing their team and staff to work on the project. They never tried to twist our arm or anything like that.
Yep, I would agree with that. Okay.
All right, so next one, Darcy from Australia is asking, short of improving stability and small evolutionary changes, is there anything cool, big, or different you'd like to introduce into Merb or play around with, be it as a plugin, slice, something else?
All right, so for this one, you have to wait for the keynotes. We won't answer that. There's a surprise in the keynote, so.
I don't know about surprise, but that question is explicitly addressed in the keynote.
So I have an app that's deployed with users and authentication and everything. Big picture, how do I chunk it down to migrating to Merb?
Go, Daniel.
One of the things with Merb is it's not going to dictate to you how your particular authentication is going to work. So basically, if you port your user model as it stands and you can develop a strategy to mimic the one that you were using with your current application. That's really all you should need to do, and just set up the protection, just like you would normally.
Can I just say something? So what Daniel doesn't say is that he worked hard to be able to get a user moving from a Rails app with RESTful auth that was written by Rick Olsen, which is a great plugin.
Awesome.
And if you want to actually move to Merb and we don't have the same plugin ported over, you can actually use Merb auth, and there's a mix-in that's built in that will use exactly the same type of approach, so you don't need to redo your user models and stuff like that. So Daniel spent a lot of time making sure that this kind of transition will be smooth for people, and then if you want to move to more strategies, if you want to change the way you deal with authentication, you can do it.
Indeed.
Right, but just to follow on from what Matt said, there is a salted user by default that comes in, so it really is just move your user model across and mimic the strategies that you were using there, and you should be right to go.
And we, of course, support Active Record. So.
All right, so next one, Justin from Philly again asks, how does Merb Core see Rubinius support in the future platform?
As soon as it runs Rails, it'll run Merb.
All right.
So cool things about Rubinius are that it gives you a lot more introspection capability into the language. So there's definitely, when Rubinius is good and fast, maybe not even as fast as MRI, I personally want to add development mode support for, like, in a stack trace, being able to see what the state of the locals are. You can do that in Rubinius. That's cool, right? So there's a bunch of things that you can do in Rubinius that you can't do in MRI, that as soon as Rubinius is viable, as soon as Rubinius is running Rails again, I think really is the point. There will be some work on making it, allowing it to show you cool things that you can't see in MRI.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tools, development tools and stuff especially, that will really benefit once Rubinius is production ready, as far as refactoring browsers and a number of introspection tools. Since it gives you a much more clear picture into the runtime, I think you're going to see Ruby tooling support just get much better than it has been so far. Which is
there's a thing that Rubinius did recently that's really cool, that because Rubinius is sort of still getting back towards the point where they could run Rails, which is actually, I feel like, really close at this point.
Yeah, they're running like 80% of the specs again on the new virtual machine.
So they added now the parser and the compiler. The compiler was always Ruby. The parser is Ruby now. So you can do stuff like reopen the parser, modify the parser, reopen the compiler, modify the compiler, require a Ruby file, then revert.
Yeah, Evan's been talking about adding some sort of macro facility to Ruby in Rubinius, which would be pretty cool.
Obviously, we're never going to do anything in Merb that's going to not run on. We're never going to have a Merb that you can't run on MRI, but to the extent that we could add especially cool development mode features, or a thing I've always wanted to do is instead, so you have like merb.logger.debug or merb.logger.error, right? And it has to call a method to be like, is error actually, are you in the error mode? And then it like tries to make a no-op, but it's not really a no-op, right? It actually has to call a method and do some checking. It would be cool if you could say, if you're in Rubinius, compile this file so that if you're in production mode, don't even ever call merb.logger.debug at all,
Yeah.
right? So stuff like that wouldn't actually prevent you from running it on MRI, because in MRI you would still do the same thing we do today, but could be optimized for better compiled techniques.
And I think we also want to offer the same type of support to other implementations like maglev and I Run Ruby, and whichever other one that people might come up with. We're not going to limit Merb to Rubinius once Rubinius is out. I mean, this is really out of the question.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. I think action args working on JRuby is a good example of that not being the case. It also works in Rubinius, by the way.
All right, so next one from Michael, still in the room here. Yes, just like RJS covers up JavaScript, is Merb stack going to cover Merb to the point where it will be painful to get under the hood?
No.
No, not at all. that would be a bug.
Actually, yeah, I agree. Actually, all of us use Merb and aren't. I don't think any of us, maybe some, but I don't think any of us really are going to use Merb stack in real life. So.
I will.
I think we'll probably. I don't know. It's a tricky balance. I think we'll probably want to be using it so we make sure it works. But I think all of us will have apps that run Merb without Merb stack, like small apps. If we ever write a GitHub post commit hook, we're going to be writing it in simple Merb.
And right now, after you generate a Merb stack app, it takes about 4 seconds to get back to Merb core.
Right. You just have to comment out the lines.
Comment everything out.
We're not. The point of Merb stack is to build a bunch of functionality that you might have to build yourself. It's not to like hide away the 6,000 lines of code that Merb core is.
And it's not because some of us are not going to use the stack that it's not going to be fully tested. This is going to be the top priority for us to make sure it works properly. Yes. I know personally working for clients, I need to have some sort of stacks. And I might actually end up having my own stacks, but I will always come back to the main stack and make sure it always works because that's what most people are going to use. And we actually want your feedback. If you think the full stack doesn't fulfill most of your needs, you need to tell us. You need to tell us, well, this is totally useless. We're wasting time by just removing this dependency, and it takes memory for nothing. However, there's this new stuff that we really like that you should have in the full stack, and we're totally open to your feedback because we actually do that for you, not for us.
All right, next one. Our presenter from yesterday, Lori, asks, one of the things that she dislikes about Rails is how the mindset of the Rails core developers has changed as Rails has gained popularity. Do we have to worry about that here?
Nah, I don't think so.
No.
You guys all saw the core tenets of Merb on my presentation yesterday, and if any of those are violated, it's a bug, and I will kill people.
An important thing is I think. So Rails always talks about how useful it is that their thing is extracted out from a real app. But what that led to culturally is that 37 Signals uses Rails the same way a lot of people use their own custom CMSs that they give to customers. It's part of their app, right? If they have to change something, so they change it. Big deal, right? And they don't. It's definitely the case that because it's extracted and because it's still very much an important part of the apps that it was extracted from, that you'll hear a lot of times from the core team members, I just don't care about that, right? That's not important to me. If you want to do it, fantastic, write a plugin, but that's not important to me. And because of the fact that the Merb project is not sort of tied into specific applications that we're trying to build, it's not just our version of our CMS that we built or something, we're actually always thinking about the community. And I don't want to say that Rails isn't thinking about the community, but that's really our day-to-day, the Merb core team members, when we're working on Merb, it's like, how can we make Merb better? It's never, ever like, how can we make Merb work for some application that we're building?
I think the difference between Rails and Merb is that here in the Merb team, we're all very opinionated, but we have different opinions.
That's
and
also true.
that's the reason why the main opinion of Merb is not as defined as the Rails opinion.
The main opinion is to not have an opinion.
Right. So we need to actually cater for all the needs we have, which are different needs, and that's why you end up with all the flexibility we have.
I think one other thing is that because we have the API and the public API, we can't just say, go build a plugin, we don't care about that. We have to, if we want to keep the thing cohesive, we have to say, we can provide for that. We need your input into the Merb core to be able to keep the API sane.
Yeah, we just had a meeting at lunch in which we pretty much agreed what we already all knew, which is we're never going to say, oh, just go write a plugin and do monkey patch whatever you want. That's like the anti what we want to do.
We just can't say we don't care about that feature.
And
not-
we're
it would
we're
work.
subject to the same rules too when we're working more.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yes.
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 The question was, do we code against the public API?
Every single module in Merb more has to code against the same public API that you would write if you wrote a plugin. So,
And if you find a place where we don't, please let
bug.
us know. It's a
Bug.
bug.
yeah.
All right.
So the question is, come ask the question, Laurie. So what was the question? I don't know if I should repeat this question.
She says we're not acting like Microsoft. That's true. We are not.
We have
acting like
Microsoft people in the room, so we might not repeat the question.
Basically what you're saying is that we're not having special APIs for ourselves that we don't give everyone else, and that's true.
All right. Next one, Pavel from London asks, how do we support internationalization in Merb? Did you abandon the Rails internationalization solution?
What is?
All right, so that's a very good question. No, we did not abandon internationalization, and we still want to do internationalization, but we want to do it in a way that respects the Merb way. So when we started, I personally was involved with the way Rails got internationalized, and I worked on the API, and my goal was to get the same type of API for Rails and for Merb. I personally use Rails and Merb in my daily work, so I need it in both. The problem is the way the API implementation was done in Rails was not matching the needs or the rules for Merb. Merb is really about performance and speed, and we cannot slow down Merb. If Merb slows down from now on, that's a bug. So we needed to make sure it was working fine, and I work with Yehuda quite a lot to make sure that internationalization will not slow down Merb, and it was actually slowing us down because of the implementation in Ruby land, which actually goes by the C-land problem. Anyway, I'm not going to go into any details, but no, we're working on that. It's going to come soon, but we want to do it right. We want to make sure that people who don't need internationalization won't be slowed down because of that.
Right. I could also talk a little bit. I put out a call a while back for, hey, can everyone tell me how we should do Unicode? And actually, Unicode and localization are two different problems. Unicode is just a feature missing from Ruby. So I strongly feel like the way to add the feature to Ruby is to write a C extension that adds Unicode support to Ruby. I've already done like half the work for it, and I was just talking to Carl about this. We should finish it. Basically just by adding MB_size, MB_reverse, and MB_slice to string. So now you have multi-byte. Ruby actually already supports multi-byte characters and strings. It's just that all the methods that like size and reverse and slice and whatever don't correctly support Unicode characters. So step one has to be actually add Unicode support to the language. What Rails does is effectively something similar to scan a regex dot, a regular expression with dot, and then you have an array of characters which you use in Ruby land, and that's unacceptably slow. Right? That's literally like you have an array of characters in Ruby that you got by running through the Ruby regular expression engine, and now you do stuff to that array. So that's just basically a non-starter. So, which means that the only real solution is to do it in C. Again, I've written about half the code for that already, so we're just going to finish that.
And also, we started setting up some sort of API for internationalization inside the Merb plugins.
Right.
We're working on getting things done properly. So we don't want to lock you to one plugin. We already have a bunch of internationalization plugins or localization plugins out there that would do different things. it's not hard to get your views being localized in different locales. Like all the helpers you get for dates and stuff like that, they're already internationalized. You can pass the format you want, you can register the formats. But we want to have a proper public API so people can extend and use locals the way they should be used and do the type of internationalization they want to do. If they want to store that in Memcache or in the database or whatever type of implementation you want to do, you should be able to do it, but you should not slow down Merb.
Right. Like we see our role to make an API that you could build localization on top of, and then we will probably make one such implementation that will be part of Merb Stack. But if someone else wants to make one that does something else, that would be fine too. So because that's generally how we operate, it didn't get done for 1.0. Right.
But it's coming, and I think it's better to wait a little bit. You can get your Merb app in whatever language you want. That's not a problem. Like if you just support one language and you want to have it in Russian or in French or in Spanish, that's really not a problem. If you want to have 2 languages, you need to use a plugin. And that's where we felt that it was better to spend more time to get things optimized. Hopefully we're going to be able to port some of the stuff we're going to work on to Rails, so they will be able to also get their, get better performance out of that. I think it's great that they added internationalization to 2.2, sorry. But we just want to have a different approach to it.
Definitely the C code, the C extension will work in Rails. You'll be able to use it in Rails.
So we're not just trying to do something different than Rails.
Okay, with Ruby 1.9 coming around in December, has the Merb team gone in that direction at all yet? Are you?
No.
No, none.
Well, December is, I don't know if we should address the...
It's still, I mean, I think 1.9 is still a ways off before it's really going to be production ready. Even the release in December isn't going to necessarily be production ready, in my opinion.
Right.
There's a bunch of changes. It's not the same Ruby. I think it's going to take a while before people adopt that. That said, Merb should run fine on it, but just haven't tried it in a while. It used to run fine.
It should run fine, but some random dependencies that you might use might randomly not run fine. Right. That's the problem, is that there's a whole bunch of language level changes, and so all these gems that people rely on occasionally just don't work on 1.9. And 1.9's API, maybe now they're claiming it's locked down, but I think they claimed that last year also. At this point, there's no clear guidance for what exactly the core team is planning on doing with 1.9 at all, the Ruby core team. So we have to just wait until people are actually using 1.9, I think, before we really do anything.
Yeah, about addressing that at the Ruby level rather than at the framework level. What about all the other implementations of Ruby and keeping that compatible, how the behavior is across the different implementations, since it's addressed at the Ruby level rather than at the framework level?
You mean for Unicode or?
Yeah, Unicode and whatever you're doing for internationalization, if you do it in Ruby as opposed to in Merb or at the framework level.
Well, so first thing is JRuby handles internationalization and Unicode in a very nice way in Java itself. So I'm sure we're going to be able to work something out with them. I don't know about Iron Ruby and Maglev, but I'm sure we can find solutions. And during the process of setting up a proper internationalization, we're going to work with all the different players. And really, we're not, a team of people that just go somewhere and we're going to get something ready, and if you don't like it, that's too bad. We really want to get feedback from people. We're going to work with all these people to make sure it works. If they want to be involved, we're going to make sure that it works for them too.
All right, so the last one we have online is Dmitry from Ukraine is saying that you guys on the panel are all Ruby and Merb hackers, but you got to help us get to that level. Can you advise us on a few most effective steps that we can start doing right now to get there?
Why don't we start with Ezra and work our way across?
Read code, right? There's nothing you can do better than reading code. It's probably not the exact answer you want to hear, but that's how I got where I am, is by reading interesting code and trying to grok it and going and looking stuff up when I didn't understand something and playing with it in the terminal and this and that and the other thing. And that's probably the best advice I could give you, is go read code. This is mostly applying to just becoming a Ruby expert in general. Just go read all the code you can find and try to make sure you understand it.
And then hack. You actually got to do it. There's no way to get around it. really trying to go through all these frameworks and, I don't know, trying to fix bugs or figuring out what's going on is the only way to do it. There's no way around it. So just do it over and over again. You'll just grow, improve doing it, and you'll learn a lot by reading it and then trying to hack it and then redoing it in your own apps or that kind of, just got to code.
You have a bunch of good books out there that will get you started with basic Ruby stuff. I think if you have a background in programming, you should be able to get up and running pretty quickly. I would say read books, read all the blogs, see what's going on there. GitHub is a great place to actually read code, as I was saying, because you can just browse all the code you want. The other thing is probably local groups. I know here in San Diego we have the SD Ruby group, and it's something that's very helpful for people that don't really know. They can come and ask questions, get together, come on IRC if you have questions. Try to find people who can actually help you. That's the way it works, and then spend hours on it. That's, write small apps, get started, usual stuff.
One of the things that I've tried to do is, if I don't understand something, I just try to break it down into its simplest case and then run a few test cases on it. Having said that, one of the main things that I've done coming from a mechanical engineering background, so I never really did much programming until fairly recently, was I made sure that everything I did was fun, and if I wanted to do something, it was cool, because that really kept my motivation high to keep going and keep learning new things. And I think it's important that we never just sort of get into a daily grind with it, that we do make sure we keep doing things that we enjoy.
I would say ever since I started programming, really, there's always been a point. I've always been doing something, and there's something right above me that seems impossible. Like, I don't even know how I'd begin doing that. That's crazy. And I always do that. And if you always do that, if you keep doing that, eventually you'll be doing things that you didn't even know existed. Like, I don't know, I just rewrote the Merb server, and I didn't even have a conception of what Unix sockets were, or, I don't know, like a year ago. So basically just always figure out what it, never say, oh, that seems too hard, I'll leave that for smarter people. Right? Always do that thing.
I would say just write code, and specifically write code you care about. Scratch your own itch. If you're going to write code just for the purpose of learning how to write code, you're going to get bored and stop really fast. So find something you're interested in learning how to program. Find something you're interested in, you want to program for, and write that program. And just do it. I mean, try and make it work. Release it as open source. Let people tear it to shreds, and learn.
There's definitely nothing like open source. Like releasing your own code as open source, vulnerable, out there in the world.
I think we also have 2 books coming up. There's the Merb Way and Merb in Action. I think from what I read from what you guys started, Yehuda and Ezra and Michael, I think, it goes through the steps and the main concepts behind Merb. So if you want to get started, it's a great way of understanding what's going on behind the scene. Like, why do we do things this way? And then honestly come and ask us, like, why did you do that in the bootloader? I know that we spent some time, Michael Clishin is actually writing some sort of handbook on GitHub where he talks about the internals of Merb and how everything's work. It might be a bit too advanced if you just come to Ruby, but it's a great way of trying to understand what's going on and understand why we don't like, alias method chain. If you don't know it, why is it bad? Come and ask us. We'll try to explain that to you. That's something I really appreciate with Yehuda is when we have questions, you can, most of the time, if he's available, you can ask him, and he will actually explain it to you. He won't tell you, oh, you're too stupid, you don't understand that. And I know I grew as a developer because I would be able to go to different people and say, dude, I really have no idea what's going on here. Do you mind spending 10 minutes just explain to me what's going on so I'll be able to do it better, and next time I can teach somebody else.
Also, I would say the book that came out recently called The Ruby Programming Language by Mats and Joe Flanagan is, you have to actually read it, but it really goes through, this is not about programming, but it's more about like understanding quirks of Ruby. It really goes through a lot of little quirks of Ruby, like what's the difference between a lambda, a proc, and a block? A lot of people don't know the answer to that question. But it goes through it in meticulous detail. How does multiple assignment work in Ruby? So that's if you're looking for like understanding quirks that maybe elude you at the moment, that book, if you read it cover to cover, is fantastic. The Ruby programming language. It's by Matz and Joe Flanagan.
I also recommend keeping like a little Ruby sketchbook. Make yourself like a little scratch directory. Every time you come across some new idiom you think is cool or you don't understand, make a little snippet out of it and try to understand it, write a little test for it, and keep that around. And also make little benchmark files for different techniques and keep that around. And that will really help you pick up on all the quirks and edge cases in the language and give you. It takes a while because there's a lot of edge cases, but once you get a feel for what constructs are expensive and what are not in Ruby, you will be thinking in Ruby, and keeping a sketchbook like that really helps.
Yeah, definitely benchmark mercilessly. The Ruby, if you go to download like Merb core, there's a directory called experimentation in there, I think, and in there there's a benchmarks directory which has like benchmarks for millions of things. Basically, all the time we're like, oh, I wonder if that's slow, and you just check, and it actually really changes your. Knowing what sorts of things in Ruby are slow and what sorts of things are fast doesn't always enter into when you're writing code. If you're writing a script that like does something, who cares? But actually knowing the answer to the question, just every time you're like, I wonder if that's slow, just check. It's good.
All right, next one. Lang from right inside here asks, along those same lines, can you each talk about your workflow on a typical day with regard to coding? You can address the mix of test to code, etc.
So I'm not much of a TDDer, I hate to say. I know everybody's really big into it these days. I'm much more of an experimental spike something out. And I've learned Ruby well enough where I can run most code in my head and know it's going to work or not. So I tend to like to spike something out and get it working and see it working, and then write some tests to back up my theories. That's just what works for me. TDD works really well for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for me.
Usually I'll start with a spike too, but it'll usually be in a completely separate area. If I don't know what I'm doing at all, which is usually where I start, I don't really know where I'm going, so I'm going to bang something out, figure it out, and then I think writing good specs before actually writing the final code is really important, mostly because it will, first writing out, I really like writing out the specs first, because then I'll finally flesh out all of my ideas before I go and finish up the internals. And I can find out where I'm going wrong quicker.
Let me say one more thing. So maybe I do kind of do TDD, but I do it in a different way. Like with Ruby, I find the best way to develop is to say, okay, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. So I will write out the code of like a DSL or the API call or like a little Merb controller or like a nanite actor or whatever. I'll say, this is how I want to write the code, the end user code. And then I will take that and use that as a test, and I will go build the back end until it can run that code. So I guess that is kind of like TDD, but a little bit different. So I think, and especially in Ruby, I think that's how the most elegant APIs get designed. Make the API first, like write the code exactly how you want to write it, and then go make a back end that can run it.
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question is, can you each talk about your workflow on a typical day with regard to coding and test to coding balance, that kind of stuff?
So I kind of agree with you guys. What I do maybe slightly different is that I'm very process oriented. So I want to kind of write down what I want at the end of the day. Like this is what I want to achieve. And I just use English words. And then I try to write specs for that. And then it's kind of in the middle. I don't really know if I write first the type of API calls I want to make, or if I write the test, it kind of goes together. It's because you write your spec and you say, well, this is how it should behave, and then I write the API call that I should make. So it kind of goes together. Often what I do is also when I'm done with something and I'm not pairing with somebody, I want to get some sort of refactoring, and I will ask people. That's something we do a lot. Like somebody will implement something and we'll ask somebody else just to have a different opinion on it. And then often when we actually disagree on what's the best way, we just go to the benchmark, and that's how it works.
Yep.
I do have my little Ruby test folder on my desktop, and actually I have it in one of my OS X stacks. So, you could hear that, right? It's just right there. No? Oh, I actually have a little Ruby test folder in my OS X stack that I can go to right away. So I think that's really helpful, and I work a lot in just small, quick Ruby spikes.
Yeah, I think what we try to do, just in general, is to work only on small items all the time. So we're not going to take like a big feature and just implement it all at once. We have a tendency to break down things in tiny bits.
Yeah, I tend to like to, when I'm thinking about something, I tend to like to bounce ideas off other people as well. I tend to find that if I just go and implement something, then somebody will come back and just have a totally different insight that I didn't have, and it really helps to bounce ideas. Then once I've sort of started to get a really good idea of what I want and, of the API that I want, I start to just write pending specs, like sentences. It must, it needs to do this and this and this and this. And then I'll go and implement the back end based on those specs and the API that's in my head generally. And like as Matt says, I tend to sort of work in smaller parts. I like to work in smaller parts.
Yeah, I agree with Ezra, actually. Ezra, I think you said it isn't TDD, but actually it is. What Ezra is saying to do is identical to what I do and say you should do, which is don't write. You're thinking it's not TDD because it's not like mock-based or something. What you're saying to do is to write how you expect it to work, and then write some tests that check to make sure it works, and then make it work, right? So that's exactly how I think about it. I say, okay, I'm going to make a new API for how you should implement an adapter if it expects to be able to fork or something. And then I'll actually write the API, and then I'll go make it work. And I'll usually write specs that check that the API actually works as well. So that's the specking thing. It's a big deal to ask somebody else what they think about an idea before you go do it. And a lot of people in the real jobs, if you're in a good agile shop, have pairing. But when you're doing open source work, I think more often than not, that's one of the first things that goes off the boat. And you should just find someone, even if it's somebody who doesn't know as much as you do, to just look at it and be like, does that make sense? Is that sane? And I don't think it's ever happened that I've asked that question and gotten back a yes, that's absolutely perfect. There's nothing I would do differently than that.
Well, and you should add that every time we ask you if that's okay, you always say no, and you have a better way of doing it.
Yeah. I usually say there's too many new lines in that patch. actually, that's every time anybody ever submits a patch, if there's more than like 4 or 5 new lines, I just ask them, are you sure you need that many new lines? First, before I even look at the patch. And actually, like half the time, they'll like step back and be like, actually, there's an easier way to do that.
Well, that's another reason why we work in small bits, because every time we are all very opinionated. You're going to do something, you're going to send it to everybody, you're going to have 3 different opinions. And if you write like a big piece of code and you send it to everybody and everybody's like, no, that's not the right way, it kind of feels bad.
I sort of agree. I'm last again, so I have to come up with new stuff.
Watch TV or something.
What's that? Watch TV.
Do you listen to music while you program? Yeah.
Not very often, actually, unless my coworkers are talking a lot. Crap, I had something and now I've completely lost it. I was going to say something about what Yehuda said about talking to people, even if they're less skilled than you, and I find it's actually extremely useful to talk to somebody who may know nothing about the problem. Just even the act of explaining it to someone is extremely useful.
Yeah,
like they can just sit there and say and just the act of telling them it, you're going to be like, oh wait, that doesn't actually make sense. To actually get it verbally out there.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when you know a problem too well, you'll be like, well, that's just impossible, so I'm not even going to try. But somebody who's like a total noob to it doesn't know it's impossible, so maybe you'll get this crazy insight from them where they're like, well, why don't you just do it this way? And you're like, oh my God, it's not impossible.
Actually,
kind of blinded by your experience.
That's a big deal. Nothing's impossible. Like, maybe some things are, but they're not impossible until you've spent like 2 days thinking about it. Like, it's not enough to sleep on it. Seriously. There's tons of cases where it seems like it's a binary problem. You have to either do this or this, and what's the third option? And there's almost every time when it's usually a case where I'm like, okay, how does Rails do it? And I look at it, and it's like, I don't really like that, but it seems like that's the only way, right? And they obviously thought that as well because they did it, right? And then I just don't do it, and I just think about it and talk to people about it. And frequently there's always another way. There's always a different way, a more expressive way to do the thing that's faster, or there's always another way. We completely rewrote we patched Erubus so that we'd be able to handle a common case that Rails handles by like evaling into procs, which is like really slow.
So what you need to know is when we don't know how to do things, when we're not sure, we actually go and look at other projects. And that's another reason why we had somebody from Django that was invited to talk this morning. It's because we learn a lot from other projects. We do look a lot at how does Rails do things. We look at how other frameworks do things, and we try to learn as much as we can from other people that experience, they went through all these problems before us. So more than likely, they came up with a conclusion that we might like or not, and we can learn a lot from it.
And sometimes just talking to a lot of people about, I would say it's more important to do it with hard problems that seem intractable. Just don't ever assume something is as intractable as it looks.
All right, so next one, Abraham in the room asks, if we see something that really interests us in Merb and we'd like to contribute, what's the process that you guys would prefer for doing so?
Carl can go.
I don't know. I'd like to see a patch.
Should have tests.
So we do have a process, right?
I mean, if you're unsure, first of all, I mean, you can always ask us. There's a mailing list. There's IRC. There's all these channels. There's even, the bug Lighthouse, take a tracker. Besides that, if you want to a lot of people just will write a patch and send it, and then, even if it's not accepted or like it's rewritten, or a lot of times it is just accepted, but I've written, or when I got started with Merb, I wrote a whole bunch of patches that just didn't get accepted, and I learned a lot by doing that. So
I think we have a process, and we try not to reject patches. And I would encourage you to come and talk with us before you submit patches, because it can be very frustrating if you spend hours working on something, you think you did a good job, like you submit the patch, and one of us or somebody else will tell you, no, it just sucks. You should not do that. It's very painful. I'm sure most of us went through this path once, at least in our life. We try to avoid doing that, but sometimes we do, and I'm sorry about that. Come and talk with us. We have rules like, it's better if you can give us some specs, because if you don't give us any type of test, we're not going to accept your patch, and we're going to have to write the specs for it. If you don't know how to write specs, like you don't know how to test things properly, and we're going to try to document that properly so you wouldn't be able to do it a proper way, come and ask us, ask in the mailing list. The process is usually to fork the repo, work on your own branch, so we can actually cherry pick if you only fix one bug at a time first. That's probably the first thing.
Every bug that you fix should be in its own branch in your repo.
So we can actually say, okay, I like how you did that, but this, probably you should redo it, or maybe here are some pointers to do it better. And we don't have to totally just reject your patch. Don't send us a pull request. Most of the time we won't accept them because we don't just have time to go and look at all the stuff you did and what
I'm actually the only one who has access to see the pull requests.
Yeah, do a Git format patch and attach that to a Lighthouse ticket.
Yeah.
Or, you could also say, give us a branch. If you say, pull from my master, pretty much we're never going to ever do that. But if you say, pull from a branch that fixes this ticket or a branch that fixes this bug, that's that's as good as a Git format patch. It's probably even better because you can keep that branch up to date as Merb moves forward. Whereas when you submit a patch, if it doesn't apply cleanly, we're gonna have to like hunt you down and try to figure out what you were trying to do. So the best thing to do is to make a bug fix, and then every so often just merge our master into it, so that when we actually get around to merging it in, it's actually relatively up to date.
When cherry picking is pretty cool with Git and makes things easier for everybody. So.
Also, good commit messages are really helpful. Don't just write bug fixes or something.
Well, and maybe before you spend hours trying to fix a bug, ask us if it's really a bug.
Right, yeah.
That happens often, that people tell us, oh, I worked on this patch and stuff, and it fixes this problem, and we tell them, well, that's actually not a problem, that's a feature. Or we actually decided not to go this way. So don't waste too much of your time. We will try not to be mean with rejecting your patches. That's really not the purpose. We actually need more contributors. We want people to actually do it and help us, but we want you to do it the right way. And this is our job to actually teach you how to do it the right way.
Another important thing is it may not belong in core. That happens a lot, where people are like, oh, I'm going to add a new multi-part parser that does this edge case, and it's like 600 extra lines, right? And if that's true, it handles like some edge case, possibly we'd put it in more, maybe, right? So definitely come to us first and be like, seems to be an issue in core, especially if it's for an edge case. How do you want to handle it? And I would say even making a patch that you aren't sure if it works, but demonstrates what it is that you're trying to fix. We get a lot of patches that we just don't accept at all, but we're like, oh, okay, I understand what they were getting at, and we'll just do it differently. So I would actually, if I was a person who was submitting patches in the hopes of getting them accepted, I would consider that getting a patch accepted. If you submit a patch with, here's how I would do it, and then we say, oh, I agree with that's a bug, and then we go implement it differently and close it, that would be victory for me.
I would also say like a patch with just failing specs that demonstrate the bug is much better than a patch with no specs. Like specs and no code is better than code and no specs.
Yes.
The other thing is we accepted a bunch of patches until now before 1.0, and the thing is now we're actually going to limit the amount of patches we accept because of the public API. So make sure you don't break the public API. Like really, if you want to patch something, check what you're doing, because we're not going to accept any patch modifying the public API.
But we're not going to leave your patches open for a year. Right. So don't worry about that.
Yeah, I've got a question about deployment. Are you guys what is your favorite deployment strategy? So you've got your development environment, you've got production servers and test servers and staging. Are you guys just doing it manually? Are you using some kind of Capistrano thing or Vlad or?
Yeah, Capistrano or Vlad, either or. Push the staging first, make sure it works, and then push to production.
Yeah, I would tag, and I would. I just said that sort of half-heartedly. We had a long discussion in the office recently about the fact that apparently in the Ruby community, people make releases all the time off trunk and don't tag. You should not do that. You should tag. I know it's like, oh, we're so agile, we could just always release off trunk. The problem is that when someone calls up on the telephone and says, your app doesn't work, and you say, oh, when did that happen? And they can't point to a specific version, then you're having to figure out, oh, I think I fixed that bug. And you're like, no, I don't know. Right? You actually want you want your users to be able to call up and say, 1.16 is broken. So if you fixed that bug in 1.17, it works. You want to have a process. You want to know what's deployed to production, especially if you use Git. So I would definitely do that, and I would use Ruby Enterprise Edition, especially if you use Merb, because Merb 1.0 is tuned to use Ruby Enterprise, and it gives you worse memory usage if you do not. Worse than even the existing Merb if you do not use it. Slightly worse.
Yehuda, can you explain a bit more about Ruby Enterprise and why it's good to use it?
Sure. So Ruby Enterprise is, I think it started as a patch to Ruby that is languishing, but there's I think that's true. That's what they say is true. So it's a bunch of fixes to the Ruby garbage collector. The primary one is that it doesn't store. So Ruby's garbage collector goes through all the objects, tries to see if they're referenced anywhere, and then marks them, and then goes and does another pass, and anything that's not marked, it sweeps. So it's a mark sweep garbage collector, and it just stores the can I find you bit directly in the object. And the problem is that the way Unix works is that if you do that, when you fork a process, so now you have two processes, you want to be able to share as much memory as possible. But because Ruby goes and actually tries to run the garbage collector, now all the objects in the second process are different objects because they have a bit in them. So the long and short of it is that you end up not being able to share almost any memory between forked processes in Unix with the regular standard Ruby. And Ruby Enterprise fixes that so you can share a bunch more memory between Ruby processes. And we wrote the master process thing that people have talked about, just takes advantage of that behavior in Ruby Enterprise so that you can have 4 worker processes that share memory between each other and with the master process. So if you use Ruby Enterprise, the master process is free. It does not cost any memory. All the memory in it is shared by child processes. We've verified this, even under heavy load.
Can you explain how to look at that when you run, let's say, a Merb app on the macOS version and you want to just make sure that you're not lying to us?
Sure. So if you go into Activity Monitor, there's one of the columns that's not normally there. It's called rprivate. And rprivate is all the memory that is used only by this process. So it doesn't include shared memory or dynamic libraries. So that's the number that you're looking at. And if you look at that number with Ruby Enterprise, you'll see that it's significantly smaller. And if you add up all the numbers with and without a master process, you'll see that the master process doesn't actually cost anything because the rprivate for it is shared in the child processes. Anyway.
So you right-click in Activity
Monitor, you say rprivate. Anyway, it's definitely true. So the point is that if you use Ruby Enterprise, you don't need, in development, it doesn't matter, who cares, with an extra process lying around. But in production, you really want to use the version of Ruby that A, saves you 30% memory, even if there was no master process involved at all, and B, makes your master process free. So I would just do that. That makes sense.
But Merb needs to support the old way of doing things because only maybe there's not even 0.5% of people in the Ruby world use Ruby Enterprise.
Let's all use it though. I agree. We need to. So we added originally there was no matter what there was always 2 master processes. The second master process allows you to do a fast redeploy, and we made it easy to configure that out. So if you want to turn off fast redeploy because you're using regular Ruby and not Ruby Enterprise, it costs you some memory. You can do that. But if you use Ruby Enterprise, all the features are free. So I agree that a lot of people don't use it, but you should use it. Tell everybody to use it because it's free. It gives you free memory. Why would you not do that? If someone was like, here, I will give you an extra 128 megabytes of RAM for free, obviously you would take it.
Just about deployment, something that's important to understand is if you bundle your app, meaning that if you get all the gems and all the dependencies you need and you put them in the gems folder with your app and you just deploy your app, you need to make sure that all the native gems get recompiled because you might have them compiled on your system, which is like Windows machine or Mac OS, and then you're going to deploy to a Linux machine and you need to recompile them. We have a Thor task for that, and that's being documented. It's pretty easy to just say, redeploy, which is basically rebuild the native gems, and it will take stuff like hprecut and just going to recompile them for you when you deploy.
Right, so that solves the problem of having gems that are vendored in your application that can't automatically go to the remote. All you have to do is in your Capistrano task say, I think it's Thor, Merb, redeploy, and then it just takes care of that for you.
Yeah, I think it's Merb gems redeploy, something
so just
like
do
that. So.
In your deploy task.
I have actually a recipe on my blog, merbis.com, where I actually show how I actually do it. So I personally use Capistrano in this case. You can use whatever you want. It's really up to you. We don't have something that we say this is what you should use. Some of us use Capistrano, some others use Vlad.
I think Vlad, by the way, has a bug still. Not Vlad. Vlad and Datamapper both have to define a top-level repository method under kernel. So there's potentially, since Vlad just uses a regular rake file, potentially some weird interaction there. And I think both Vlad and Datamapper at this point have agreed that defining a top-level method with a common word is not a good idea. So I think they're both going to fix it.
Also, you want to look at all the different options you have to start Merb. A lot of people don't realize we have a lot of options when you can start by doing -C4. That would start as cluster of 4 children. You can start more if you want. You have a lot of different options that are very powerful. If you want to start with thin, it's pretty easy. You just do merb-a thin, and you have thin. We have all these options that maybe are not very well documented yet, and we hope to have more people to help us with the wiki.
Minus capital C is really cool. If you're in development mode and you do minus capital C, and then you hit Control C in a, like, when it's running, it will drop you into a console. You could, like, do whatever you want, and then get out. It's just cool. And minus capital N is, well, if you run with minus C4, so like cluster 4 in development mode, just to see like how that works, you can do minus capital N and it will not daemonize the cluster. So you can see, you can like hit Nginx, you know, go through, hit a bunch of your mongrels, and it will actually show you in the console what the log would say. Which I found mainly useful for like developing the clustering support in the first place, but I could imagine that somebody might find that useful.
Did that answer your question?
All right, so we are out of time. We had a few more questions, but they agreed to stick around in IRC and maybe answer if one or two of you guys can jump on.
Sweet.
But thank you, everybody in IRC, for all the great questions and even from in the room. And thank you, panel, for all the great insight.
Thank you very much.